why I'm going to let her introduce herself, but today we have the honor to have Dr. Jessica Turner coming all the way you're traveling from Bloomington but she's also going to DC right after this to be on a meeting discussing National Humanities Council. She is the current director of the American Folklore Society and my dear senior colleague and 学姐 from Indiana University Bloomington, an expert.
Just a little bit older sister, only a little.
Yes, we go way back, and she's sort of my senior mentor as well. So you have a lot to learn from her, and by the way, she speaks fluent Mandarin, right? And not just that, yes. And ask good questions today.
Or ask questions, right? Whether they're good or not, depends on what we dig into, right? So I'm really glad to be with you all here today. I've prepared a presentation, but I also kind of like to do these kinds of presentations, choose your own adventure style a little bit, so we can stop and talk about different concepts. You can ask questions. This can be as much about your understandings of heritage and tourism and performance and how we display that as it is about my presentation in China. I have had the privilege of living in China off and on since 1996, probably a total of about 3 years of my life. And seeing China in 1996 and then visiting, the last time for me was 2019, incredible difference in economic mobility, incredible difference in social mobility and what is accepted socially. And so a lot of what I have been paying attention to is how that gets manifested in performance and identity and how people think about cultural identity, which is as complex in China as it is in the US and everywhere else in the world. So my background is in folklore and ethnomusicology, and I did not know either of those terms when I entered college. I think a lot of people do not know folklore and ethnomusicology as fields of study when they start to think about what they want to do with their lives. And so for me, I was really interested in tradition and culture and stories, and especially the stories that I grew up with. Interested in food, really proud of where I was from, which is the Appalachian Mountains, right on the border of Tennessee and Virginia, where Tennessee and Virginia and North Carolina meet. That is where my family is from. And so I grew up watching, my community both embrace or sometimes retract from being Appalachian and what that means. We all see this in our own lives, like how you embrace a certain part of your positionality and your various identities and various heritages, and then sometimes have to retract from that, at other times in your life. And so I was really interested in that. And when I was an undergraduate, I studied, I had about 7 different majors. And I embraced that. I actually really encourage you, whatever degree you end up getting, to study everything that you possibly can, because it's gonna build on whatever it is that you're doing, be that computer science or business or humanities and creative writing and teaching and education and all of those kinds of fields. Because I like to think of it as one great big world, and it takes all of us. It takes the techies and the fuzzies to make the world make sense. And so that's kind of how I got into the work that I do. I got my master's and PhD at Indiana University in folklore and ethnomusicology. I went to China on a Fulbright. I went to China a few different times, but the longest stint was in 2002, 2003, 2004, in the place that I'm going to tell you about today. And I've been back there over the years to both see what has changed and to catch up with people. And sometimes that's a painful thing to do, especially when you get to know a community in its own place and time, and then you see a lot of change and upheaval happening, social change, political change. So I'm going to be talking about that today. So Your job is to just be along for the ride. If you didn't read the essay that you were assigned probably only a week ago, because that's when I sent it to Dr. Kwong, that's okay, because a lot of what I'm talking about today, is actually just detailed in a little bit more kind of theoretical and narrative mode in that article. Dive into it. You will not be quizzed on these lectures, but you will be quizzed on kind of how you take this forward. That's kind of how I think about what we learn from the concepts that we learn in classes that are about, global Asia or the humanities or art and tradition and everything. So you learn a lot of details. I'll give you facts that actually may be outdated by the time you see them in my PowerPoint. And so you don't need to learn those details and those facts. Those are Googleable later on. And if we're wrong in our PowerPoint, the rest of the world will correct us, and thankfully we have those kinds of resources. But the concepts, thinking about how it applies to what you want to study, thinking about how what I'm going to be talking about in China with intangible cultural heritage actually relates to something very deeply in your own life, or the community that you live in, or the community that you may be working in some days. So, title slide, we don't need. I'm going to leave this PowerPoint kind of in working mode just so I can toggle back and forth between some video and it not be awkward in that sense. So if everybody can see it in this mode, I will leave it like that. Is that okay? Okay. So some working definitions. You'll see I didn't put definitions up here for you all, and that's because these definitions are malleable, they're always changing, and it's also good to kind of think about how we also embody kind of senses of these definitions as well. But you're going to hear me talking about a few different terms a lot today. One of them is tradition. Tradition is something that can be very old. It could be a tradition that you just started with a group of friends just last year, but it is something that is special enough to repeat. We think about family traditions, we think about college traditions. Traditions are everywhere, and we also often argue about traditions. Tradition gets really tangled up in policy, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm also going to be talking about heritage. Heritage can be a very politicized word. You often hear it used in policy or used in cultural ownership, like this is my heritage, this is not your heritage. And so that is absolutely the case when it gets to global heritage policies like that of UNESCO and World Heritage Sites, tangible heritage and intangible heritage that are designated as World Heritage. But really, who wants to throw out an idea about what is heritage? What does it mean to you? A working term. Yes?
Who you are and where you come from.
Who you are and where you've come from. I like that. Yes. Anybody else?
Just the things or the way of life of your people.
The way of life of your people. That's a good definition too. Yes, sir.
Whatever you decided to be.
Whatever you decided to be. That's true also. Because sometimes the way of life of your people might be, on your dad's side such and such, on your mom's side such and such, and I see it this way. And often do we think about heritage as being things that we would like to also, histories that we may not want to retell? Maybe not. Sometimes, and I think it's important to retell all history. That's my opinion. I think it's important to learn from that. I think it's important to who we are, even that history which carries trauma. I think that's really important. We often don't call that heritage, though. Heritage is often what we choose to carry forward. And so sometimes that is things that are difficult, but often as you think about cultural heritage, when it is defined by a group, and a group, I'm telling you, is never going to decide, wholeheartedly agree on what is the heritage to carry forward? You can have that discussion at a family gathering this coming season. Talk about what is the heritage of your family and what it is that should be remembered. And I guarantee you not everybody would agree with that. And that's okay. I think we all kind of bring to that exactly what you said just a moment ago. It's what you choose. It's absolutely what you choose. And I'm going to be talking about intangible cultural heritage today. What is intangible? Yeah, you can't touch it. So unlike the Egyptian pyramids of Giza, that is a World Heritage Site, and maybe unlike some of the Native American mounds in the United States that are also heritage sites, and maybe unlike, say, maybe we could think about Tlingit canoeing carving as a way of passing down a particular historical tradition of making canoes. Intangible heritage, you can't touch it. Makes that really hard to police then, doesn't it, if you can't touch it? If you can't say, this art is heritage and this art is not heritage, that makes it also very difficult to then decide, like, okay, what is the heritage practice in this? But often when we talk about intangible cultural heritage, we're talking about the practice of. In my community, it might be the practice of making apple butter, in the fall. I grew up doing that with my family in a giant copper kettle outside on a farm. It may be henna tattooing practices and just the technique and the design. It may be hair braiding or different ways of caring for aesthetics through those kinds of practices that become part of a cultural identity. And so intangible cultural heritage are sometimes the most important things in our lives, and you can't touch it. It then becomes really difficult when it gets to a World Heritage designation and you're saying, this style of singing is Chinese intangible cultural heritage. And Mongolia says, I don't think so. That's Mongolian intangible cultural heritage. And so you can see how the movement of people, the movement of culture, and certainly if you've learned anything about globalization, it's hard to keep culture in one place, certainly when we have the internet, but even way before that. So I come from a place, Appalachia, that was always called isolated, and yet it never was. I mean, it's its own very intricate, intersected, amazing place that has a lot of different cultural influences over time. And so it's very hard to find a place that has never changed or never will change. And so like that, thinking about heritage policy or tradition policy, it's not about that. It's about protecting what is important culturally so that it can get carried forward. And sometimes that means actively changing it so that it can it can continue in practice. So maybe that's the most lecture-y part of what I'm going to talk about today, but let me give you two kind of main points. And this is, maybe as deep as it's gonna get today. Scholars of heritage seem to widely agree that heritage is closely linked to identity, that it has been utilized for government nationalist objectives, and that it is challenged by cultural change. Intangible heritage management has sought to restore and revitalize heritage items through recognition and programming, and these practices are both encouraged and monitored by intangible cultural heritage systems. That all sounds like, a lot of control, a lot of restoration, a lot of revitalization, and that can often be the case. Nevertheless, I think it's important to remember that governments or anybody who's creating the heritage policy, could be your grandma, are often not as prepared to support the process of heritage transmission as they are to legislate the existence of heritage items. And research in heritage programming illustrates the roles that individual actors play in the transmission of arts knowledge as intangible cultural heritage, and addresses notions of ownership within this programming. So unlike the case where government decides policy and how it gets carried out gets really messy, individuals such as your grandma then therefore have a lot more power, because it's the individuals and the individual actors that often get to shape what it is, how we think about tradition and culture and heritage. So let me pause for a second and let's leave steamy East Orlando, and let's for a second look at a map of China, which can also be steamy and hot this time of year as well. The place that I'm going to be talking about, if you look at a map of China, it's going to be very much far to the south. This would be considered southwestern China. That's because politically, geographically, historically, anything like west of here was the West in Chinese geography. So the southwest part of China is like, it is here, but it's also down here, very much in the due south. And so where I have spent a lot of time doing research is close to the border of Vietnam. It's right here at the South China Sea in this area, Guangxi province. Let me show you a little bit of a map of Guangxi province. And the place that I'm talking about is not on the border of Vietnam or on the sea. It's going to be up here in the mountainous area. And if you've ever, let me just see, as we hop around here, if you've ever seen photographs of, well, here on my title slide, those mountains, those very uniquely shaped pointy mountains that are called the Tiger Tooth Mountains, that are often surrounded by water. This is an iconic part of southwestern China, these mountains and water. And mountains and water figure into people's identity, it figures into culture, it figures into the way they practice tradition, and how they think of themselves. So let me just pause for a moment and give you a little bit of a flavor, musical flavor. You had an article of mine to read. That did not come with any music clips. So let me give you a bit of a music clip that will accompany kind of the things you are reading about and the people that I'm going to be talking about today. This is from that mountainous area, and you're going to see a bit of a Dong music festival. Dong is the name of a group of people. It is an ethnic minority in China. And you're going to see a little bit of a festival called the Sama Festival. So what you can't hear very well are the drums and the singing. But when you're immersed in one of these festivals, you also hear just you're surrounded by the sound of that silver clanging together. The silver on their festival attire. That's right. So we'll stop there. It's okay. So I don't want to take too much time on that. I just really wanted to show you a little bit of these kinds of festivals as they happen in real time. They happen in these giant squares. You'll see some traditional architecture in the background. You'll see circular patterns. You'll see people wearing the same thing. A lot of those, and you see especially the women who are wearing, let's see if I can grab one, that traditional silver here. That is all handmade. All that is embroidered. So there are layers and layers and layers of really important cultural traditions that go into just being part of that community. But what's really interesting is that being part of that community also means that you're living in a place where there are lots of other ethnic minorities. And something to note, I don't think you've in this class have really talked about the 56 ethnic minorities of the People's Republic of China. But I think there are a few key points, as you think about what is ethnicity and how is it designated and who decides. It's complicated in China just like it's complicated in the United States. I mean, how much do we argue over what are the labels on the U.S. Census every single time? Because it matters to get that right, and it's really hard to get it right. At the same time, you may have one of those Dong women who has married a man who is not from that community. He may identify as somebody else entirely, and so you have family units that are already very intersectional in the way that they think about ethnicity. But I think one of the key points in terms of thinking about ethnicity in China, the Han majority is about 92% of the population. So when we're talking about ethnic minorities in China, we're talking about a very, very small number of people. And many of them, the Manchu, the Uyghur, Tibetan, Mongol, those are ethnic minorities that come specifically from certain geographies that are contested geographies, political geographies in China. But then you have other ethnic minorities. If you look at, the top, number 2 and number 3, for example, you have the Zhuang and you have the Hui. The Hui minority in China is really your Muslim believing minority group. It is not necessarily a racial minority group. It is a belief-based minority group. And so there are many different kinds of individuals that are then lumped into what makes somebody Hui, but it is a Muslim minority group. And the Zhuang minority group was really not established until after 1949, after the People's Republic of China was established. And it was established by designating a group of other ethnic minorities into one particular designation called the Zhuang. So if we think about the passage of time and how many generations you have identified as whatever ethnicity you identify as, sometimes it's very complicated when you live in a new political reality when those designations get shifted in different ways. Many argue that China's ethnic minority designations are a way of controlling politically people who live sort of on the minoritized fringes of the country. And there are a lot of political scientists who write about it in such a way. Other folks write about ethnic minorities in a way that those designations allow people to identify and celebrate their traditions in ways that they wouldn't normally have the same kinds of designations. And so there are critiques on all sides of anything that we'd be talking about when we're talking about ethnicity in China. And so what you did or will read that I wrote talked about 2 different ethnic minorities in China, the Zhuang ethnic minority and the Dong ethnic minority. And what you just saw a festival piece from was a Dong ethnic minority festival. What you see here is a Dong ethnic minority performance, and you see 2 different groups of Zhuang women performers. One of them from the community that I'm going to be talking about, and another one from another community that I spend a lot of time with. Thinking about ethnically, sometimes there are not very many differences between some of these drawn groups. Some of them get designated by the kinds of clothing that they wear. And we think about, well, isn't that really strange? When you think about examples of that throughout the world, how just a geographical designation is what designates ethnicity, or even how people think about what, thinking about sub-denominations of various religious groups being the way that they designate. And sometimes, in some religious practices, that is also tied to how people think about themselves ethnically. And so it's an incredibly complex, too difficult to unpack in an hour kind of thing. What I'm trying to get at is how complicated ethnic minority designations and politics are in China. But that's not unlike any other place in the world where ethnic designations, racial designations, political designations often get very complicated and blurred as we move about and just live our lives, right? But let me take you back to a time in 2001, 2002, when I went to China on a Fulbright. And I wanted to study heritage, and I wanted to study tradition. But what I was finding is that every place that I went to in Guangxi province, where at that time there weren't a lot of white women visiting, not a lot of foreigners from outside of China, people were so excited to say, what are you here for? You're not here as a tourist. Maybe you are here as a tourist. Everyone assumes you're a tourist. And if they're not, they still want you to be a tourist. If you're there to study botany, doesn't matter. Come and see this village that has just opened up to tourists. And so when I was there were, small village after small village just opening up for tourism. And people were so excited about that. Why? Not because, they really needed the validation of this young white woman to come. They needed my money. And they also really wanted to make sure that these business and cultural, really entrepreneur kind of ventures were successful. And so trying to get people to come and see what we have just built to celebrate our tradition, but to also make money celebrating our tradition. And that's what I've found over and over and over again. And so I wanted to kind of see in a comparative way how people thought about themselves and their identities, similar to how I grew up thinking about what was identity in Appalachia. How I thought about myself, but also how people thought about me. Anytime you leave and somebody says, "Say that again, I just like to hear your accent." You're always kind of getting marked from the outside, and that affects how you think about yourself on the inside. And I wanted to understand how that was happening in this one place in China. But what I found was that a lot of it was tied to tourism, and a lot of that tourism was tied to economic development policies that was allowing these small minority villages to open up. And so that was really the words that were used. We have just opened. Come and see us. So this village that was there 1,000 years ago, so excited. We've just opened. And so trying to find out what's going on here with all of these things that have just opened. What is that doing to tradition? How is policy impacting how people are practicing tradition? And certainly studying some classic anthropology from that time, and that is tourism is bad for culture because it's a fake version of culture, right? The Disneyfication of tradition. If you think about, if you ever study anthropology, and certainly you study tourism from an anthropological perspective, there is a term, the Disneyfication of, and I think we're right in the heart of that right here. But what I also found is that it's really hard to say tourism is the inauthentic and what's happening in people's homes are the authentic. Because again, life gets messy. People are choosing to start a business for tourism so that what? So that they can make money, so that they can preserve some traditional practices, so that maybe they can talk their children into staying home and making money in the village rather than moving to Guangzhou or Shanghai in order to get factory jobs. So it's allowing families to stay together. And so as we critique the policies of tourism or the policies of heritage that I'm going to talk about, we also see how, nobody in these, it's all debatable. When people are practicing this locally, they know that the policies may be shaping how traditions get practiced. You're not pulling something over on them. They're choosing to practice in that way because of the reasons that I just stated, and sometimes many other reasons that we don't necessarily know from individual case to individual case. And so what I found at that time was that while tradition, we seem to think of it as being very unmoving. If anything in your life is something that doesn't change all the time, you think of tradition and heritage as being that. But what I found in this time of just swift change, swift economic gains, business opportunities, changing government policies about tourism and about heritage, suddenly everybody's like, I got to find my way into this, and I'm going to find, and I'm going to figure out how, how maybe I can make a living doing this, how maybe I can save my family from having to get broken up and go work in factories, how we could think about carrying on this really important tradition, and often that's what happens in these, in these emergent kind of tourism performances. I'm still calling this tourism performance because that's what I was experiencing in 2002. Let me give you an example of how chaotically emergent some of this was. So if you've ever studied Chinese film, you might know the famous filmmaker from the 1980s and 90s, Zhang Yimou. And Zhang Yimou has made some of the most beautiful films in China, and was also very popular with those films globally, not just in China, but globally, a beloved filmmaker. And so as these tourism initiatives were getting underway in Guangxi province, Zhang Yimou, the filmmaker, also thought, this is beautiful cultural tradition. I want to do something amazingly artistic too. And so in one of the most frequented tourist sites, destinations in Guangxi province, Yangshuo, if anybody, how many of you have been to Guangxi province? I should have asked that. Okay, that was my assumption. So I was speaking as if that was my assumption. If you ever get the opportunity, go. It's a beautiful place with amazing people, and it's just a wonderful cultural traditions, but also beautiful scenery. So that's what Zhang Yimou was capitalizing on in this performance that he created, which he's calling On the Largest Natural Stage. So again, we're here in the mountains and the water. The mountains and water, think about where are the most beautiful sceneries in the United States, for example, and think about, what if one of the most celebrated artistic directors / film producers decided to take that natural scenery and create something of a performance there. And so what happened was he produced, by learning about all of these different performances that were happening in these different villages all around, and how people were thinking about what are the traditional performances. I mean, and obviously this is not all happening in 2002. People have been doing these histories for a very long time. What is histories of folk music in this area is a very long history and tradition in and of itself. But let me give you, we have sound. I was just making sure y'all are awake. So, yeah. So what this filmmaker did was also choose to celebrate the people of these communities too. And so this, not just the singers and the dancers, but the fishermen, the culture of being on the water, and the very unique way of fishing with cormorant birds, you know, using cormorant birds to dive into the water and pick up a fish, and then you pull that out of its throat. To kind of just say, this is a beautiful place and a beautiful scenery, beautiful culture, very much worth celebrating. And so this is a performance that I actually was in Guangxi the year that this opened to you know, really wide acclaim, you know, and also strong critique, because, you know, how many times do you see a performance of a certain thing? You know, we think about the way Hamilton in some ways both celebrates and takes hip-hop dance traditions, right? We can talk, you know, you can see how there is critique in that particular performance. But one of the first times that fishermen were performers, or that farmers were performers. And so in this sense, like the actual entire culture was part of this performance. I'll send all of these clips with Dr. Kwong, and she can, you know, you can, you know, screen them with, you know, your wings on Saturday night, which I'm sure you all will do. But 500 plus performers doing this very large, amazing production of what was designated as the most traditional elements of this place. And so as I was there, seeing how, wow, okay, we've got this going on, we've got this going on, and then visiting these smaller villages that have just opened. Come and visit us, we have just opened. What I was studying was really how what anthropologists were criticizing as being very much, you know, all of these performers are performing to recorded music. It's canned. They're all singing the same songs. What was very, I think fascinating about that research was seeing how individual performance groups were doing research and crafting their own performance shows in these brand new spaces. And so, like, is that tradition? Is it tradition when I gather, like, okay, now we're going to lock these doors. We are now the Dr. Lan Lan Kwong ICH performance group, and we're going to learn over the next 2 months this thing, and then we're going to all do it together, and we're going to call it tradition. Is it? Is it tradition? Is it tradition if we research maybe some of the I don't know, maybe traditional art forms that are from Central Florida, and we're recreating that? Is it tradition then? Maybe. Is it tradition if we bring in a few people who actually grew up in Central Florida and know those art forms and can teach us those things? Maybe. But at what point, I mean, you can see like this, I mean, things are complicated because when you call something tradition and when you don't, it's very contestable. And so when I was doing research with this group of women who were singing traditional songs from their Zhuang people for tourists, you know, in this authentic, you know, in their village itself, I had other scholars who would come up to me and say, nah, that village is not authentic. You know, it's only been there 800 years. If you want to go study an authentic Zhuang village, you have to go, you know, 3 hills over and study the one that's 1,500 years old. And so you can see, again, how sometimes comical some of the arguments about what gets to be tradition and what doesn't can be, when in fact what is the more interesting question for me is not is this traditional or not? You know, we're all using that word differently anyway. Is this red, or is it like a dark magenta? It's that kind of comparison that almost doesn't make sense. Instead, I think what's interesting is, what are these people trying to do? What are they trying to do, and is it working for them? And what about their community? What about their historical practices? What about their heritage are they wanting to carry forward into the future? And that was a really fascinating part of my research. These Zhuang ladies learned from their teacher, Wu Jinmin, who is not Zhuang. He's a Dong man, and had his own performance group in a village nearby, but also had studied songs, traditional folk songs, for decades before teaching these women what some of the Zhuang songs were. So who's teaching who? Who's the authority? All of these questions get very complex and very interesting when you're also talking about people who are also sometimes sharing the same household. And so what makes somebody an ethnic minority from a particular region and therefore can perform for the Chinese government, you know, authentic Zhuang songs, becomes, you know, something that gets very, very complex. But what I found was very interesting is kind of when I was doing research, I wanted to go back to this idea of the commons. And if you think about think about a traditional or historic farming village, say in England, where all of the houses are tightly, you know, built together in the village. You know, there's the pub, there's the church, there's the school, there's the probably the Amazon package drop place, and then all around that are shared farmlands. That is the commons. And you know, in the 1960s, there were really environmental anthropologists talking about the degradation of the commons. What happens when we lose access to things that are shared? What does it mean to share things? And when we think about our cultural commons, what is that? So think about that for a second. Think about who you are living in the United States. Think about who you are in terms of your heritages or your ethnic or geographic backgrounds. And what are some of those shared common things? And when you think about that, you know, think about what would it mean then if somebody started making money on that shared common piece of you, right? Something that is shared. So in a sense, the songs of these villages were part of a commons that when I was doing research, I was thinking about some of the critical scholars who would visit, and they would say, all these songs sound the same. Sometimes they're using the same cassette tape back then. They're using the same cassette tape, they're playing it, they all sound the same. What is authentic about this? Well, what is authentic about it is that it is part of the shared cultural commons that people are learning and celebrating songs that are part of a shared repertoire. You know, and it means nobody gets to own that. So you think about who owns the copyright for Happy Birthday? Who owns the copyright for XYZ? You know, when you think about some of those really contested copyright cases about a certain you know, melody line, a certain rhythm. I remember that it was Gloria Estefan got into big copyright trouble many years ago, back in the 80s. If you don't know who Gloria Estefan is, please look her up. But you know, part of that is we share certain musical tropes. Nobody gets to own that, right? And yet, sometimes we live in a world where we do own those things. And if you're going to use this, then you're going to pay Jay-Z. And if you're going to use this, then you're going to pay Michael Jackson. Or maybe not even the artists themselves. Maybe you're going to pay, the recording companies that own the masters for a lot of those things. So interestingly, people argue over what is common cultural property. Who gets to own common cultural property? And so what UNESCO, let me move forward a little bit to say, again, this is something that's Googleable. In 2001, this was a year before I arrived for that long time in China. In 2001, UNESCO recognized Conchu opera as a style of ancient Chinese opera. It's one of many amazing styles of historic Chinese opera. And that opera style was recognized by UNESCO as ICH, Intangible Cultural Heritage. That kind of launches this idea that China has intangible cultural heritage that is not just significant to the communities that these things are practiced in, but to the world. And we think about, global music traditions that are important to the world. You think about, the United States invented jazz, it invented hip hop, it invented bluegrass. But that's not, those are not the only places where those styles are practiced. And it's part of more or less a global heritage that really, who gets to own? At some point, it's shared culture. It's part of a cultural commons that everybody gets to own. And so when these designations of this is important cultural heritage were starting to take shape, and China signed the UNESCO ICH Convention, which is an important, really a convention signed by a lot of countries, not yet the United States, to kind of be part of a process of naming and taking care of things we can't touch. We're going to name it, we're going to designate it as important, and then we're going to vow to take care of it. So China started, they have, and China is always an industrious nation, full of people who, there's so much pride, national pride in China, and governmental organizational capacity to pull together folks to then start applying for UNESCO designation. So China has more ICH, named Intangible Cultural Heritage designations, than any other country, part of this industrious effort. At the same time, China was like, yeah, UNESCO, we've got you. We're going to do this all on our own too. And so they launched the national representative list. So even if it's not considered a world intangible cultural heritage, in China there are thousands of cultural items listed as intangible cultural heritage. And what does that even mean when you get into the thousands? What's not? At some point, what's not ICH? And actually, I was at a festival once where someone on the back of their shirt said, "Even I am ICH." And it's this recognition that our culture is significant, it's incredible, it's worth preserving, we all care about it, we all get to be part of it, it's shared. And so, from 2005 on, China has systematically created a system where thousands of items of ICH are recognized at either the national level or the provincial level or the local level, and people are listed as important bearers of that culture. You're a significant singer of this traditional art form, and we recognize you. And guess what? Now you get a bit of a paycheck so that you will continue to carry on that important cultural tradition so it's not lost. And so then you can imagine if that becomes the system, then people get very competitive and protective at how things get practiced. So over the years, people have talked about what is the cultural ecology? What's the original ecology? How do we think about who inherits ICH? In other words, how does it get passed on? How is it protected? How is it safeguarded? It's the safeguarding language that you hear about in the ICH language. How do we protect it while also helping it to continue on? Okay, if suddenly the practice of I guess maybe tattoo art, body art, was so sacred that we don't want to do anymore. You can only do these designs. This is the way we do it. And these are the authentic, tattoos of U.S. body art heritage. And if that is the way we think about it, what happens to a cultural tradition if suddenly you only get to look through a flip book and decide what is body art heritage? So when you go and get your body art, you can't say, just be creative, because you go to a specific artist and you say, I want your design. I want your design. I want it to go all the way up my arm. And then when I get more money, I'm going to come back and we're going to get this other side, but it'll probably be another year because that's going to cost a lot. So even these policies recognize that if you're not constantly helping to produce and to help develop the traditions that you're suddenly enshrining, then they will cease to be. It's true for all culture, right? Once you put it in a box, in the language of anthropology/museum studies, once you museumize it, it starts to lose its vibrancy in community, because then suddenly we're saying, oh, wait a minute, this is a traditional art form, and let's just look at it. Let's just look at it. Let's not go out there and do it. Let's not go, see what amazing new body art we can, or especially artists. Let's go find the most innovative, up-and-coming artist. Nope, we want the traditional only. And so that's, you see these kind of things playing out in very complex ways in China. I'm not going to show, since we've had a little bit of a delay on our video, I'm not going to show a bit of video that I wanted to bring to you. Maybe I'll show just a couple of minutes. You're hearing a style of song that is designated as World Intangible Cultural Heritage. So, Dong Grand Song. And there, it's sung often in festival by the women that you saw wearing that traditional silver in festival attire, and also it's a really intricate singing style that is world and national and provincial, like so many different designations of the grand song. And let me show you a little bit of that as it is. This is not grand song. This is other style of dong song that was performed at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival in Washington, D.C. When was China part of the festival? 2000, I forget. It says 14 right there. So one of the things that make these styles of music very unique, and that's part of like the designation, right? Unique cultural heritage, is the harmony of the singing style, but also how, what makes these songs special to Dong people is how it connects to nature. And so I'll make sure to share this video clip. It's only about 10 minutes long, with Dr. Kwong, that you can see this person who, he figures into the article that you read, but it also figures into the last thing I'm going to tell you. How he talks about the connection to nature being one of the significant pieces of that, including something like in this, you read about how common is the cicada song. And here it is being performed in DC at a festival, but what you'll hear musically is how song and song harmony and song style can mimic nature. So the cicada song is a singing style that really mimics the sound of cicadas. If you've ever lived in a place that has really loud cicadas, then that sounds really familiar. And it's beautiful. So I will be sure to share that. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about was that particular individual that you read about in the article, and also you saw that him briefly on this clip. Wu Jimin was the teacher of these Zhuang ladies. And as you learned in the piece that I wrote, when the tourism shifted from where he had his Yinshui village, where he had his performance group, over to this other village where he had taught these young women, he decided, I guess I got to go there too. I got to go there to continue doing my practice, to continue my entrepreneurship. And so there was a bit of the women were not happy. Many of them he employed in his new show that got built in a brand new, all of these this is a Zhuang style of architecture. Historically, people would live on the upper floors and the lower floors would be where you had your livestock. And that way you could bring them in and have a place for them on the dirt floor, and then the family would live in the upper levels. And then over time, certainly as more and more people visit, and there was a need for guest houses, a lot of Zhuang style houses would get built with kind of your cafe, restaurant, open space on the lower floor. I don't know where the livestock went. They went, on the outskirts of town. They were marginalized in that sense. And then the upstairs was more like a guest house kind of space. He built a performance hall right in the center of town, in a place where he had helped these Zhuang women create their own performance group, and practicing their own Zhuang historic folk songs.
Do you want to leave some time for questions?
I do. I'm going to finish in like 2 minutes. So be thinking about that question, good or not, and for us to talk about. So, one of the interesting questions that I had was, how does, who gets to own this work? Who gets to decide where it happens? I had been doing research, and this happened about 7 years after the year that I was there as a Fulbright scholar. So, when people create, a space to really honor their own ethnic traditional practices, as specifically Zhuang, what happens when suddenly that concept has to grow to be, these are all the people of the Longji region, not just Zhuang. These are also Dong people here too, and that becomes the narrative. What's interesting beyond that is that the video that I'll send a link to was produced even after that, and Mr. Wu Jimin had moved on yet again. So he is no longer at the village that you read about in the article that I wrote. He is now down in Yangshuo, which, just Google Yangshuo, China. I'll send that you. Dr. Kwon can tell you how to spell that, so when you do Google that, you'll get the right place. But Yangshuo, China it's one of the most iconic tourist sites that you'll go to, and it's where filmmaker Zhang Yimou did his enormous Impressions performance too. So now Wu Jimin is down there with his own performance. Choosing to make good on government policies while also protecting and preserving what he sees as his cultural heritage. You know, it's hard to argue with that. You know, is it authentic? Is it not authentic? Is he right to do that? Is he not right to do that? I think, you know, all of those questions are super interesting, and so tied up in the policies and the individual communities that are then kind of hammering this out. So if you're ever interested in doing more research on intangible cultural heritage, not just in China, but certainly in China, what you'll find is that the scholars have shifted away from studying the policies and more to how are people kind of negotiating and managing to live with those policies in their communities. And that's continually changing because those policies are continually changing too. So I'm going to stop there so there are some time for questions. And I hope there's at least a question. Yes, sir.
So when it comes to world cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage, what is like some distinct differences that you can make between the two? Or is it more or less like there's more similarities than differences?
Taos, New Mexico. The Pueblo and the adobe structures in Taos, New Mexico is designated as a World Heritage Site. And that word site, I think, is the key there. UNESCO also designates intangible cultural heritage, and that's, you know, the cultural things that is not a physical site. And that would include things like Peking opera or Khonshu opera, or the grand song that you heard in that, just a little snippet of in that clip there. There are many styles of music or weaving, or think about the things that you do in practice as a group of people that are designated as intangible cultural heritage. And so that's the intangible. And then in China, they're like, yeah, and we're going to do all of our own designations too. So then there's an even deeper layer with many levels of that, of where things are getting recognized. And some of it has to do with, you know, UCF campus has an amazing memorial lawn. It is its own special place here. It's not important enough yet to be considered World Heritage Site, but maybe in the state of Florida, it is significant. So Florida might say, okay, you know, in the state of Florida, we have this, well, I don't know if memorial lawn, I just walked across it. That's why I'm thinking of it. Buck Tower, you know, in Central Florida, the highest elevation in Florida. Might be a place that, in terms of World Heritage, the United Nations Convention and all of the committees that focus on that, they may not be saying, yeah, Buck Tower is like, that's World Heritage. But it's important to Florida because of its historic value, its, you know, its place within, you know, kind of like thinking of geography, and histories that I probably don't know about too. So I don't know if that helps make sense of some of the differences there, but yeah, it can get pretty complex.
Right, one of the examples that I'm a little familiar with is dreadlocks and how they were both Celtic and African, and how synchronicity plays into that. I was going to ask, as far as China is concerned, how would synchronicity affect their culture, if it does at all? Because like you said before, with the Mongol and Han, their songs sound exactly the same. Is there a shared origin point, or did you just happen to sound the same?
And that, sir, finding that out would earn you a PhD in ethnomusicology. That's what ethnomusicologists do, not just origin work, but that's an incredibly deep and complex question. When it comes to what the example that I gave just a minute ago with UNESCO designations, there is a case where Mongolian throat singing and Mongolian style throat singing are both representative ICH of Mongolia and China. So there is an overlap there in a synchronistic way. Yes, this idea that sometimes things develop in different places, and a lot of that, again, being sort of thinking critically about ICH designations, you can think about how politics and lobbying have to play into so much of the way that we live our lives, and what gets recognized or not get recognized. But there are good cases to be made for how those things get, they kind of develop in their own ways in a lot of different places around the world. That's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to ask more of a general question about, I guess, how like, ethnomusicology as like a subfield kind of works, and like how you would study that as like your PhD or your master's.
It works in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to grab you right after class, and we're going to talk about that. Yeah, I'd love to share more about that, as with Dr. Kwong, who is an ethnomusicologist herself. Yeah, there are lots of different things you can study and pathways into that kind of thing. Yeah, and I'd love to see what you're interested in.
So you talked about tourism communities, and before that you talked about these villages opening up their communities to tourists in order to not only, you know, like earn money because of it, but also spread the culture in some way. You referred to it as Disneyfication, which I thought was a very interesting term. It reminded me of the term romanticization. So do you think there are similarities or differences between the two terms, Disneyfication or romanticization? Do you think romanticization has affected this sort of way of life within the culture?
And we could go for another hour on just that one thing. As we think about Disneyfication of something like The Lion King, for example, when The Lion King was created, one of my professors at Indiana University was called by Disney because she was the director of the Archives of Traditional Music, one of the oldest music archives in the world. And she also had her own field work from West Africa, and a lot of field recordings from her own, but also were in the Archives of Traditional Music from different cultural communities throughout Africa. And Disney said, we'd love to be able to use some African recordings for this movie. And she sent them several, and they called back and said, can you send us something a little bit more African? She's like, ooh. I think that characterizes sometimes the problem of essentializing when a creative venture is trying to distill something into a short sound bite. Sound bites can be very creative in capturing things, and I know like it's 2:45 and y'all need to capture other things, so feel free to trickle away if you have to while I'm answering this question. A mid-sentence applause. But also, it's really interesting to think about how much damage essentializing things can do. So if you think about how in your, you know, if you are from a town that said, you know what, we're going to have a festival for hair locks. It's going to be the Hair Lock Festival, and we want everybody to come and be part of that. You also have to decide how you're going to present that. And so what is being presented versus what we're like, you know, this is our secret, you know, we're going to keep this one not on stage. Those are all processes that get kind of tied up into like how you're thinking about what is worth putting on stage, what you're not going to put on stage, what you're never going to speak about because it's sacred or it's embarrassing. Like, you know, like there's a lot of different reasons you wouldn't put something on stage, and it still means you're an authentic community even when you're choosing to put something on stage. So I think that sometimes thinking about romanticization, I mean, we see that culturally all the time, how we romanticize, you know, our own childhood, the good parts of it, what we choose to think about carrying forward if you have kids of your own, is part of that romanticization, but it's still an authentic part of you. You know, it's how you're thinking about what is that essential piece of it. So when we use words like Disneyfication, it doesn't mean that Disney's entirely bad. It just means that they do that on a grand scale. It's important to always kind of pay attention critically to how that is both necessary. You know, it's necessary to do it to some degree because if you're making a movie, you know, it has to be of the kind of aesthetic quality that 8-year-olds are going to want to watch, and their mothers, usually, right? But also how there is some critique in how we can always remind them, you could do that better, or you could consult communities better in that kind of way.